going through and like getting it all dialed in based on your recommendations and stuff. But
Yeah, I mean, I would say no rush on your part or anything. I mean,
yeah,
just
this course I'm taking has got plenty for me.
yeah,
I've got like a bunch of new topics. So.
yeah. I'm gonna pull up the video on my phone real quick, just make sure it's looking
It's all
good.
you.
You guys were early. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. You were on time. Sometimes we actually.
Work, it was a 5-minute drive. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just excited to learn.
No, sorry, that came out really negative. No, I mean, it's,
No. I mean, half of it for me is just meeting people and stuff. Where
yeah.
well, everyone I know is like
Yeah.
environmental engineers for some reason.
Yeah. I'm just making sure that the online thing is working. I can see
doing in-person ones for a little while now. I think I've seen the option to do
yeah.
in-person for 1 or 2 months.
Yeah, this is my second one.
Yeah, we've been, let's see, so I've been organizing it. I kind of took over organizing it after it had gone a little bit dormant during COVID.
Right.
So I kind of took it over about a year ago, and probably the first few were online, but I think somewhere around the fall we started kind of doing in person. So, yeah. Well, we'll give it just a few more minutes here in case there's online people who aren't going to hop on till 6. So, feel free to kind of, like you mentioned, networking is kind of half the fun. So, I guess one thing worth mentioning, and I'll mention this again once we get going, but Intelitech is always hiring software engineers, senior software engineers. I believe we have a Python position open right now. I don't know if it's gotten filled since I last checked, but if anyone is in the market, it's definitely a great place to work. I'm just going to double check the front door is still unlocked. I don't know if we're expecting any more people, but sometimes the front door tends to get locked without me knowing.
I think I saw like 15 on the RSVP.
Yeah, some of them I think were online, and then usually like everyone in RSVPs doesn't usually show up just because people get stuff in their front door. Also, we got these cake cracking stickers that we've had for a while, so
You got stickers?
feel free to do. You want some stickers? Here, let me get you like 5 of those. Anyone else want some stickers? Sure.
Like swag.
I'm just gonna like
Cheese, I was thinking I can't get it.
Cake cracking, it's like
there you go. Get some stickers.
Yeah.
Okay, I've used it all. I was looking from when I was.
I just looked it up like 3 weeks
I
ago.
promised someone I'm trying to give these away.
I saw it. I was looking at different tools when I was switching to Louisiana again. I kind of drove it and I was looking at it. I saw this was an option, but they used it towards SPI, so I just
take the exit and go to division.
just use that because you
Yeah.
get used to it.
Yeah, it's right there. It's like it's kitty corner to this new church. I don't know which one it is, but we share a parking lot with them.
Okay.
You wouldn't see us because we have a small signage
Me
window,
too,
but
actually.
buildings have
Is this
one.
blocking anyone? I guess you're the furthest out. Is this blocking you at all from?
Just a tiny little
Yeah,
piece.
so like, other new devs are coming in or like the ghost story or
So you
whatever.
said you just grabbed
There's a
it.
cascade.
No, no, I'm
Switch
like,
into it, or
That's the first thing he showed.
Is that
where all the best code was going to be?
That's where all the worst code will be. You'll you can skip that part.
There's a lot of these.
How's that? Is that any better? Maybe not.
It's fine. We usually post like the deck and some of the code that you use on the repo.
Yeah. So it's we have a GitHub repo. We also have a website. So everything's on there. Actually, the slides are already up on the website. So I'll go over that in one of the first couple slides, I think. So if anyone wants to follow along, but yeah, or go back and reference them. And then we used to do Teams. Now we're doing YouTube Live. So the video is basically available immediately. If for some reason you wanted to go back and rewatch the. Yeah, I'm gonna fill this up real quick and wait for the online audio.
I get you.
like a year ago. Oh, right. My brother lived there for a while. Little around. It's good city here.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I really enjoy like the orchard country and all that. We would roll through there.
Pushing into that.
More like front end
Most of
stuff.
the time we'd stay.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it all
Try
out. Whatever it takes to.
Nice, that's cool.
But
I
I
so
like
I
just-
actually we can't
it was the right
do
size
everything,
count
so I
down
accepted
there.
for the switch. Yeah, so you mentioning like cat modeling, I like the frame and stuff. My
Oh, yeah.
final project was actually like 3D printed swing.
Yeah.
It didn't work, but
That's
it's a cool idea. If we we'd had more time, they work. But
Yeah, I got a 3D printer like maybe 8 months ago.
okay.
I was running my business. Yeah, we were here, kind of dialed in for 5, and then designing and everything is smaller than 5 to 10 years. I'm shipping from Arizona out of the like programming. Burnable. So I've been in Arizona for 5 years, then overseas, that's the Middle East for 8 years.
I've got 2 USB ports and they're both full, so I've got no mouse, which is kind of frustrating, but it's all good.
So, yeah, I was studying on my own quite a bit before I came back.
How's work going?
I think the crossover is kind of cool.
Came back to
Like,
camp,
he mentioned that
and
maybe
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Unfortunately, I was doing myself just because I wanted to move
fairly new.
So
take my career to a new level.
Yeah.
And this is actually really timely
So we use
because I've inherited
so
a
for
lot
company that was
of
started by some physicists. They
legacy Python code.
Yep.
Principal data scientists, they're no longer with the company, just kind of left. It's in production.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So we have to learn it and make it work, but there's no documentation. It's riddled with
It's like crazy.
it's very slow.
Yeah.
It's very badly indecent unit tested.
Yeah.
PDF.
How you doing? Good. Feel free to just grab anyone you want. Except maybe the one with the blanket. I think that's someone's. That's yeah. You're good. You're good.
But the sensor's fine.
That's great too. Yeah. Yeah. Inheriting legacy code, especially that's already in production where you can't break it. That can present some issues. Well, maybe some testing stuff will help. We'll see. How you doing? Good. And you've been here before, correct? Okay. Cool. Remind me your name. Mike. Okay. Cool. Good to see you, man. All right. Well, I think we're at 6 o'clock.
They would always tell you like the teacher should always be learning. But that's going to be the whole side of the problem. And that's pushing into this. Every time we go to a concept now, well, start getting really good at this, start making stuff. Yeah.
All right. Don't want to cut off any good conversations, but I think we're about good to get going here. So for those of you who haven't introduced myself yet to, my name is Joe Riddle. I'm a software engineer here at Untitled Tech, which is the building you're in. And I'm the organizer and sometimes host of the Spokane Python User Group. Tonight we're talking about testing in Python. So thanks all for being here. Thanks anyone who's online right now for being here. I'm rocking the single monitor, so I don't really have a second one to like put up like the YouTube chat or anything, so I'll kind of be trying to check on that throughout the presentation and whatnot. So Spokane Python User Group is part of the Spokane Tech Groups, which is sort of an umbrella for a couple other groups that all currently meet here, including the .NET Users Group for all things C# and .NET. That generally meets on the first Tuesday of every month, as well as the DevOps User Group. I think we had at least 1 or 2 of you who had been there before. And that meets, I think, maybe on the 2nd or 4th Tuesday of every month, something like that.
There's also hosted here.
Yep, hosted here. So I guess that kind of segues into one thing definitely worth pointing out is we are planning on taking a bit of a break for the summer. We've been having them pretty much every month for a while now, and usually summer people got a lot going on, so we're planning on taking a bit of a break. You might see some online stuff, but kind of remains to be seen. And then we're hoping to come back in the fall with like maybe a little bit bigger event. But yeah. Sponsored by Intelitech. We are, I mentioned this to a few of you, actively hiring software engineers, senior software engineers, and last time I looked, we did have an open Python role that we were trying to fill. So if you are a Python whiz, definitely apply. So next .NET Users Group is hosted by Mark Michaelis, the Intelitech CEO, Microsoft Regional Director, and MVP. He's going to be actually giving a talk that he's currently somewhere in Europe giving this week, I believe. I don't remember what country, but it's modernizing C#. And so he's kind of going to go over a bunch of the new things from like C# 8 to 10 or 11. I work in Python these days, so I don't even know what the major C# version is. But he's giving that talk like this week, and he's actually going to give it again here. So that should be a fun one. And that is, if you missed it, June 14th. So that'll be the last one that's here in person for the summer. And then Python User Group, third Tuesday of every month. Not sure what the next thing will be, but. And then finally the DevOps one, Phil Spokane, the Intelitech C something, I don't remember, one of the leader people. He's talking about planning. So like planning processes. He's kind of they just wrapped up a series on Terraform, so they were doing some pretty technical stuff with that. So now I think they're kind of switching a little bit to more like planning and processes. I don't know exactly what I was going to talk about, but the meetup event is on meetup.com if you want to check it out. Follow Intelitech on the social medias. Gotta plug it. Give it a thumbs up or a follow. I already introduced myself. That's the end of my slide deck. So let's hop over to the more fun slide deck, which is not that. This one. Cool. Testing in Python. Before we jump into the actual Python stuff, any questions on the intro? I know it's really riveting stuff, finding out like who owns the building you're in and all that. Cool. All right, well, thank you all for being here. Really excited to talk about testing in Python. As I was kind of talking with a few of the guys over here, some of the more recent meetups, we've been talking about things like AI, which I honestly don't really do day to day, so I don't know as much about it. Kind of had to rely on some other people here who know more about it. But this is something that I do every single day. I'm writing tests for basically every pull request I'm creating, all the code I'm doing for customers, almost always has a unit test or integration test or some sort of test. So this is something in my wheelhouse, and I'm excited to talk about it. So to get the ball rolling, what does testing mean to you guys? Feel free to just shout it out. This is an informal meetup, so feel free to interrupt at any point in time. It's not interrupting; it's actually welcome. But so kind of get the ball rolling. What do you guys, when we talk about testing in terms of code, what does that maybe mean to you? Anyone? Go ahead.
I'm only thinking about this because, like I said, my workplace is in desperate need of more testing, which it has like one single or two tests would accomplish that.
Yeah.
Like just testing chunks of code, how much RAM it's using, how much, how efficient it runs, if there's any bottlenecks within the code, testing your functions, does it, throwing sort of maybe unexpected cases at it to see if it produces the intended results, that type of thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a great answer. So things I heard from that, and I'll kind of repeat these things for the online viewers because sometimes the mic doesn't pick it up super well, but in desperate need of tests, testing things like performance, RAM usage, that kind of thing, and then just testing the logic of the functions, or is it behaving the way we expect it to? Other answers?
Funny use case that you didn't expect, or an edge case that you didn't expect, I guess.
Edge case.
Edge
Yeah.
case. Yeah.
That's a good one. Anything else? Okay, that's good. So the way I define testing, which I kind of took the general highest level approach, the act of verifying the code you write runs the way you expect it to. So if I'm writing code that's going to, say, add two numbers together, or call this API and return some data from it, or do whatever, is it behaving the way I'm expecting it to? And we can write tests that kind of test that happy trail, like 2 + 2 is 4, that's the happy trail. And obviously, like testing that's kind of the first thing you do. But we also want to test, as you pointed out, things like edge cases, failures, things where our code doesn't necessarily go down the happy path or happy trail and something weird happens. And we want to test that we're handling that appropriately, or if we don't know how to handle that, maybe we're even testing that we're not handling that we're raising an exception to the caller of the function. And so, yeah, high-level definition of test. This was in the meetup blurb. It's pretty long. We're just going to look at this part. With tests, we can change the behavior of our code quickly and verifiably. So to your point, your code base is in maybe desperate need of some tests. And when you don't have tests and you have things running in production, maybe that's someone left behind for you to take over. Hypothetically speaking. This never happens in reality. You start poking at it, start trying to make some change. You got some user stories. You've got to add some new features or fix some bugs. And without tests, you're kind of like making changes in the dark. I think it says here in the last sentence, we don't really know if our code is getting better or worse. We might think it's getting better. We might think there's less issues with it. But in reality, we're kind of flying blind. We don't really know. And we're just hoping with, what's the expression? Like something in a prayer, something like that?
Thoughts? Waiting.
A wing in a prayer, yeah. Hey, is there a link for the meeting tonight? That's a great question. Yes. All right, quick sidestep. Oh, that is
Let's get Phil in here.
cool. One sec, Phil. If anyone has my Teams handle, you can message me and it'll just pop up on the screen.
Tell Phil he's in the meeting.
Let me have it and I'll update the meetup info. We'll just do it live. Let's see here. This guy. All right. You can tell I didn't test this presentation because I would have noticed this. Oh gosh. Okay. He offered, and so I will accept that offer. Thank you, Phil. All right. Back to the slides. Where were we? Flying blind. Without tests, you're flying blind, making changes, hoping for the best. With a wing and a prayer. Thank you. And real quick, kind of segue from what Phil brought up, the slides are available on SpokanePython.com. Beautiful website. This is Stan. He's our mascot. He looks like an upside-down golf club, but he's actually a snake. And the slides for this presentation are actually already online, so if you want to skip to the end and leave early, feel free to. My feelings will only be a little hurt, but that's okay. No, I'm just kidding. But they are up there if you want to check them out.
Was it a rattler?
A rattler? Yeah. Can't you tell? Can't you tell just what kind of? Its name is Stan. That's what's important. Stan the snake. This was actually from. I did a talk for like Pacific Northwest conference called Pi Cascades, and Stan was sort of my example for all of my slides. So he's kind of lived on, but yeah. Anyways, tried and true. Yeah. So this is what I call the Kevin Boss slide, and if you do look at the slides online, you'll notice this is actually a link which takes you to a GitHub profile for another guy who works here, or one of the smarter guys I know. And I talked to Kevin, and I said, Kevin, I'm going to talk about unit testing. What advice do you have for me? You know, what are things you think I should? Just kidding. I'm a member of the Python group. What are things you think I should talk about? And Kevin had two things, which I'll pass on to you. And I should have taken credit for him, but here I am giving him the credit, so kind of messed that one up. But two things. Think about what you're testing and why. And we'll get into that on the next slide. The other thing was naming, which clearly tells you a lot. But there's a slide for that. So thinking about testing. If you're writing a test, things you want to think about are, what am I testing? What behavior am I trying to assert or verify that is working the way I think it should be? So a couple things to ask yourself, and if the answer is yes, you're probably not writing the test the way you should be, is, am I testing boilerplate code? Like the framework, the Python standard library. In reality, I use this as sort of a trite example up front that maybe you assert 2 + 2 = 4. But in reality, 2 + 2 = 4 is something that the Python standard library is going to handle for you. And so trying and going asserting that that works the way it should is you're basically testing someone else's code. And there are times where you're maybe using a third-party library and you want to understand how it works. So maybe you write some unit tests around it to make sure that your understanding of it is correct. But typically those tests aren't the kind of tests that you want, you know, running in your GitHub Actions or in your CI/CD pipeline to prevent bugs and that kind of thing. Another question you might ask yourself is, am I testing implementation logic? So if you have, I guess again, the example addition, you could theoretically go about adding a few different ways. Maybe that's not a great example. Maybe you're testing a REST API like endpoint, like getting a list of Star Wars characters, and you expect that if you give this function the name Luke Skywalker, it's going to give you back details such as his lightsaber is blue. Now, a way to test the implementation logic would be assert that I hit this very specific API endpoint, and assert that I logged this thing to my console, and assert all this different stuff that at the end of the day could change and your test is going to break. But what you really want to be testing is sort of the expected outcome. In most cases, that ends up being the result from the function, but not necessarily actually how that function got to that result. Because that ends up, you have brittle tests, and we'll maybe show some examples when I hop into the code. But brittle tests mean that you have to change them every time you change the underlying implementation details, and that is not great, because that's more code for you to manage and to write. Any other questions you can think about when you're writing tests? I know it's kind of an abstract question, but answers are welcome. Jake, you're making a face. I think you got something on your mind.
I have some brewed in here, but I don't have any ready.
Okay, that's fine.
I'll shout them out when they come to me.
Sounds good.
As a general philosophy, do you prefer behavior-driven or like test-driven?
So
Like red light, green light, refactor.
maybe I'm not totally following.
Well,
Can you
like,
rephrase it?
Test-driven, it feels like you break it before you fix it, whereas behavior-driven, you're expecting something and then you catch all the edge cases.
Oh, I see. So
Like it does what you expect it to do, and then you look for errors. Versus you
Gotcha.
try to test out all the errors first, and then refactor to make sure the test is green.
gotcha. So behavior-driven development versus like test-driven development.
Yeah,
It's kinda-
which I mean, I guess there's probably room for both depending on the use case. But
Yeah, so there are some, I would say, sort of hardcore TDD or test-driven development kind of purists where
yeah,
cough, Mark Michaelis will literally not even start writing the implementation for the function that he's going to test until he has a test written for it.
right.
So that's really where like TDD, test-driven development, comes from, is you're writing the test before you're actually writing the code. And so I think that's maybe what you're getting at versus, I'm not as familiar with like behavior-driven development, but maybe that's just more write the implementation and then think of some tests and where it could go wrong and like kind of which one's coming first. And I'd say in practice, there's sort of like realism, and then there's like the sort of like, this is the way it should be, all things perfect. So all things perfect, someone who subscribes to the TDD way would not actually write any implementation code. They wouldn't actually, they would do test add, and then they would assert that 2 + 2 = 4, but their add function doesn't even exist yet, or it doesn't actually do anything yet. It just like returns none, that kind of thing. So basically, you would never write real code before you wrote a failing test. That kind of TDD is like write a failing test, make the test pass. Is sort of the feedback loop, I guess. Does that answer your question? Did I go off out here, left field, or?
I would just with TDD, I don't have a preference, or I can't say that I adhere to one more than the other. It's just more. Sometimes with TDD, I feel like I'm grasping at straws.
Yeah.
At times, but maybe that's just learning how to do it better.
Yeah, I think there's for me personally, there's definitely stuff that I work on where I don't really know exactly how it's going to work before I sort of, as I'm trying to implement it, I'm sort of trying to understand how I'm going to do it. And so a lot of times the test won't come first, and oftentimes what happens is I'll kind of figure out the best way to go about it, or a way to go about it. I'll get a test written, I write the test, I realize that I could have written it better, and I'll go back to a little refactoring. Hopefully the test stays the same between like the refactoring, and I can know that it was passing before I refactored and that it's passing after, and everything's good. Yeah. Other questions you might ask yourself during tests?
So this is probably a very beginner question, but that's right. When you're testing, are you like on paper, like planning like inputs that you're going to like give to your your program that may potentially break it, or some different methods that you could do? Or are you actually like writing code that uses your software to break it?
So,
Or both?
great question.
Or tests like actual like things that you're building that run?
Yeah, and it would probably help if I had like sort of sprinkled in some code samples as I was talking about this.
We'll get there.
But yeah, we'll get there in just a minute. But I would say I don't typically, and it's pretty rare that I would take out pen and paper to sort of like write down my plan for testing unless it was something like particularly complicated. But the tests are at the end of the day code, like any other code you're writing. They're just code that's running other code to verify that the other code is functioning the way it should. If that answers your question. Yeah. A good test suite, when you read through it, will oftentimes kind of help you understand what the code is actually doing. We'll get into in one of the next couple slides sort of naming conventions you can use when you're defining your test functions that will help you, even just by reading the name of the test function, understand at a high level what it's doing.
Yeah.
We'll get into that in, I think it's like 1 or 2 slides away. Cool, anything else? Cool. So the other part of the Kevin Boss slide, and I think this actually dovetails nicely with your question, Jake, is naming. And so looking at these 4 bullet points, none of them really make any sense by themselves, but I'll walk through them all real individually. So the first one is basically exactly what you were asking about, or at least the way I answered it, is this would be one way of naming a test that tells you at a glance what this test is doing. And this is something older than probably I am, the unit of test, state under test, expected behavior. So going back to maybe using like an API, like the Star Wars API, I would do something along the lines of get character underscore when name is Luke Skywalker returns blue lightsaber or whatever. And that basically is almost a real English sentence. It's pretty darn close, where you can just read it and understand, when I'm using this thing under these conditions, I expect this to happen. You know, when, yeah.
Do you have an example of like a real name for a test? Because I guess I'm not understanding with this.
Yeah.
Describe what you
So let's hop over to code real quick, and instead of keeping everything like super hypothetical. So this repo is mostly up to date for those of you wanting to check it out. So the Star Wars example, here I just stubbed out some like pretty basic code. All we're doing here is there's a thing called Swappy or Swapi, SWAPI, whatever you want to call it. It's just a Star Wars API that just gives you some like CRUD info. Can you guys see this okay? Should I dim the lights?
Yeah.
Let me, I'll just walk around. I'll walk around real quick. Instead of jumping over the table. Our light system is a little finicky, or I would just ask someone to do it, but it's like, there's a tablet.
It's very advanced.
It is, until it's not. Is that better?
Yeah.
That isn't the right one.
Yeah, it's good.
Thanks.
So looking at so this isn't a test, this is just code that we're about to write a test for. So basically what this is doing is going to this API, and in this case we're just listing out a list of all of the different Star Wars characters. If you're not familiar with the dunder name equals main, what that is basically only call this function if this is the name of the Python file that I'm actually calling. So you could have a case where maybe you have another Python module that's importing this file and using it, and because we have that print list people nested under that if, under that conditional, it wouldn't run it. And so that's just a way to both be able to use a Python module as sort of a library as well as a like a running or a runner or something like that. So first thing, we'll add test.py, super interesting name, and we will import Star Wars. is the name of module. And so your question was, is there an example of that naming convention? So, can you guys read that okay, or should I zoom in a little bit? I'll zoom in.
That's fine.
Okay. So using our system under test conditions and then expected behavior, we would say maybe test list people when API is working. Returns Star Wars characters. I don't know, this is really long. One thing about test names is that you treat the function names typically differently than you would treat a normal function name, where in this case you can see we have list people, and if you have a function that you're calling that's like, 15 words long, it's a little bit obtuse and kind of frustrating to work with. But when we're writing tests, we're trying to write them generally in favor of readability, where I can just come and look at this test and see exactly what it's, what it's doing. So if we fill this out a little bit, and we'll actually jump ahead to one of the next bullet points, I'll just stub this out into 3 blocks. And so there's probably a formal name for this, like the AAAs of testing or something like that, not the AAA that comes and fixes your car. But we like to split our tests into 3 different sections. And actually I have this backwards. So first, arrange. Typically what would go inside this chunk of code, and these are just like comments, like there's nothing special about this. It just, looking at it helps you sort of understand what's going on. Here we might have to do some sort of setup work. Maybe we have to authenticate to our API. In the case of the Star Wars one, we don't. But you might have to do a little like pre-configuration or setup work to get to the point where you can actually test the thing that you want to test. And so that's what would go here. In our case, we don't actually really have anything we need to set up. So I'll just leave it empty. And then the act would be the actual what is the thing that I'm trying to test. And from our name, you can see that we're testing list people. And so we'll do actual equals Star Wars dot list people and call that. And the word actual here, again, nothing special about it other than what it sort of implies. And what it implies is that if you look at a test suite and you follow the pattern of using the word actual, you can easily look at all your different tests and see, okay, each of these, whatever my thing that is named actual is what I'm asserting on, is what I'm trying to test. And it's just something that's kind of helpful, kind of a pattern I like to follow. Also, the Python assert keyword, if you go and look at its documentation, it expects 2 parameters, though you don't call it like a typical function. I think actual and expected. So expected would be, this is the result that I expect out of my list people. Actual would be, this is the thing that, to use the word, actually happened when I ran the code. And ideally those are the same, but they're not always. So in this case, I don't actually know exactly what this will return, but we could just write an easy one and say there should be at least 1 character returned. And so we sort of jumped ahead just a little bit, but that's okay. Real quick. So I'll install PyTest, which is sort of the de facto or standard Python test package. It's not built into the Python language. There is a package called unit test, all one word, that is built into the Python language. Though PyTest has kind of become the more popular one and people just like it better. Unit test sort of comes from, I think the person who originally wrote it came from a heavy Java background, so it's very class-based versus PyTest is very function-based. So if you write like a unit test test suite, everything is inside of a class, and it actually uses camel case, which is like, if you're not familiar, this is camel case, and this is what most people call snake case, and Python is typically snake case. And so it's like you're looking at it and you're like, this looks a little different than all the other Python code I've ever seen. I don't know what's going on here. But it is part of the Python standard library. So if for some reason you didn't have access to installing third-party packages, then you could use it. And there's there are some nice things about it, but most people use PyTest. And so that's what I just did right here. I installed PyTest. So now if I run PyTest from the command line, and I'll actually point it at my file, which I will save.
Do you know if this PyTest partner with Django?
Yep, so so that's another great thing about PyTest. It has tons and tons of plugins. PyTest, I think PyTest-Django is the name of the Django plugin, which gives you some really nice things to work well with the Django, ORM, and its models and all that kind of stuff. It has a mark, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but basically like a Python decorator that's like at pytest.mark.django.db, and it basically just handles like at the beginning and end of your test, it like sets up the database for you and then like closes it down. I haven't looked at the actual source code for that test, so I don't know exactly what it does, but it basically just
it spins up a mock database and then wipes it at the end.
Yeah, basically. I don't, because if you use Django, you'll know that you have to use like migrations, right? Yeah. Django has like tons of migrations, especially if it's a long project. And so it doesn't have to run migrations every time you like run an individual test. So I don't know how much of the setup it's actually doing within that a single test, but
it sounds really familiar to like how Laravel does it, where it spins up a testing database and then wipes it out.
Yeah, it'll do that for you, and so you don't have to like use a real database, like your real database, to connect to it. Cool. Trying to think of anything else noteworthy there, but yeah, that's another great thing about PyTest is there's like, because the Python community has kind of decided that this is what we mostly want to use, is there's tons of plugins for it. Pretty much anything you could think of, there's a plugin, including Django and other popular packages. There's probably like I think there's some like NumPy and Pandas plugins if you're more of a data science person. I'll show a link in a little bit that kind of where you can find more plugins. So back to the PyTest test.py. So a couple things we see here. One is that we called PyTest from the command line. You can also call it programmatically from the code, but typically you're calling it as a like command line function, command, I should say. And we get this beautiful green output, which is super nice. You kind of, as I saw this one talk that talked about testing in Python, and the guy was saying, he's like, I live for the green dots. Like you see this little green dot here. It's like a dopamine hit. Like, oh, I just love the green dots going across the screen. Like, I want more green dots. And then by default, basically what happens is PyTest, if you give it, in this case we gave it a specific Python module, but you can also just give it like a folder or a directory, and it'll just recursively look through that directory for anything that matches its basically its pattern matching. And so what that means by default is anything that starts with test underscore. So if you do like test underscore Star Wars, we could have named this file. And I think it might do underscore test at the end. How you doing, man?
Good. You just pull up a chair basically?
Yeah, pull up a chair wherever you want. Just hop on in. Snacks are in the kitchen if you want anything, drinks and stuff too. All right. Living for the green dots, and then, so it'll recursively just go through the directory. So if we have a whole bunch of, in like a case of Django, you have all your different apps are separated in different folders, and by default, when you add a Django app, it'll add like a test module. So if you just run PyTest at the root like package, it'll run all of those underneath. And then the other thing, in addition to the test underscore or test like splat naming convention for the files, is it will only look for test splat functions. So if I add something here that's like hello world print hello, we'll see that it still just runs one test, maybe.
That's just because you as test is the first word?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So if we did test hello world, in this case we're not actually asserting anything, so I believe it'll just pass by default because we didn't fail it. So I'll remove those. So in this case, we can see that this actually did work. If we set a breakpoint really quick, we can go into the PDB and see what's going on with the actual file. We could also log it, but if I'll do actual and Biggs, dark, lighter, don't know who that is, but you can see that we're getting a whole bunch of data from there. 82 things to be exact. Interesting. Yeah. So this isn't a super great test because I'm pretty sure this is actually a string or a dictionary, and we're not really actually testing that there's a number of characters in there. We're just sort of testing that the dictionary has keys in it. But that's because we haven't really actually fleshed out this function yet. So this is sort of like a quick little intro to PyTest, which I was going to get to, but we've sort of jumped the gun. But that's totally fine because that's probably better. Check online really quick. Not sure if anyone is waiting online. Oh, well, too late now. That's fine. They can watch it after the fact. You guys are what's important, not the people online. I tell the people online the same thing, and no, I'm just kidding. So let's see, where did we jump off? I think I covered pretty much everything here. The only thing I didn't cover was SUT, which stands for System Under Test. A lot of people say you're testing a service like Star Wars API service. You might name that SUT equals Star Wars API service, and then do actual equals SUT dot like list people. It's more of a C# thing, which most people here use C#, but I've never actually really seen it in a Python code base. So if you do it in Python, people might raise an eyebrow, but that's okay. Any questions on naming or really anything that I just showed with PyTest? It's okay. We'll jump back into the code in a second. For now, I'm going to go to the next slide. So this, I mentioned briefly, unit test is built into the Python language, the Python standard library. To use it, you don't have to install anything. You can just do import unit test. Well, I'll actually show you what this test would have looked like if we wrote it using unit test, which is mostly the same but a little different. First thing you'll notice is that we'll create a class. We'll say Star Wars tests or test. And we'll inherit from unit test.test case. And then here we could do something like setup, which by default doesn't actually do anything, but if we wanted to go and say authenticate to our Star Wars API before every single test, we could do that here. Again, we don't really have any setup work, so, and sorry, I'll kind of make it a little easier to read. So we'll actually just copy and paste that really quick because it's virtually identical. Because it's a class, it takes the self parameter, which if you were doing some setup or some arranging in your setup function, and you say to like self API key equals something super fancy, then here you could use self.api key in your test if you needed to, just like a normal Python class. And so here, I believe the only difference is we'll do, let's see, I write unit tests so infrequently, or I write the base unit test so infrequently that I don't even remember the syntax very well. Assert dot is equal, I think is what it is, something like that. So this is kind of part of the problem why people don't really like unit tests, or the unit test package all that much, is because there's about 50 different ways to assert something, whereas in PyTest there's just one. And so we'll actually pop open this really quick because I don't remember how to do it. Is true somewhere in here. Let's see, where are you? Oh, here we go. Assert equal, and then you can see if we do self.assert and just search, we'll see assert true, assert false, assert equal, assert raises. I don't know what else. There's some other stuff like assert greater than, I think is one, assert less than, assert raises regex. There's like a whole bunch of very like kind of, it wouldn't be that hard to remember, but it's just sort of a little bit more complicated than just assert whatever. And so if we do this, well, actually that's not going to work. Assert greater than, maybe? There we go. Assert greater, something like that. Just like self.assert true, but with a nicer default message. Well, I guess we could have done it that way. But if we come here, we'll just comment this guy out for now.
Seems like you could just use self.assert true and then put any statement you want in it also, right?
Yeah, that is a good point. We could do that. The thing is, as the docstring sort of explains, this gives you a nicer default message. So if your test is failing, using assert.true, actually we could do that. And so let's do both and see what the difference is. Sorry?
Oh, I was just concurring you had better feedback, right?
Yeah, so let's run it. So one thing to note is PyTest is both like a test framework and a test runner, so we can actually use it to run our unit test package tests. So we'll just do that. And let's actually get it to fail bigger than 1,000. TDD right here, write a failing test. For not greater than 1,000. So when we use assert greater, we get that's a neat little message. What if we do this guy? Assert true, length of actual is greater than 1,000. Assert false is not true. Well, thanks Python, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
But then, but you make a good point that, if you didn't have PyTest or if you don't want to use PyTest, like you can't accomplish all the same things, at least like using assertions. If we look at PyTest, let's do the same thing really quick. Well, actually, there's not even, because it just has the normal assert, I guess we could do, if we really wanted to go crazy, we could do that. Let's do it this way. And we did 1,000, so let's do that. So if we run it using the PyTest test, we see 4 greater than 1,000, which is not true. We also see this repr that reproduces sort of what our actual object looks like, which in this case we can kind of see that it's a dictionary, which the unit test I don't think was doing for us, so that's kind of nice. And then if we really wanted to try and do it this way, we actually still get, that's probably because this needs to be in parentheses. So I'm not sure what it'll tell us now. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I guess PyTest just won't even let you write it. Weird. They make you write it's true, or they make you have good console output. Anyways, so that's a unit test. It's a unit test using unit test. Say that 5 times fast. So PyTest, like I mentioned, function style tests, we're not inside of a class. You could write a PyTest style test inside of a class if you wanted to, but you don't have to. You can just have it like a sort of module level test, and as long as you name it correctly, it'll run fine. I showed writing a unit test using PyTest. We can show some more examples in a minute. One thing I haven't talked about is fixtures. So in PyTest, a fixture is basically a reusable function that does some setup work for you, and they can get relatively complex and useful. I can show an example in a minute. I think the DjangoDB thing I was mentioning, there's a fixture for that. You can use it. You can either use the like the pytest.mark.djangodb, and I think under that hood that probably uses the same fixture. Just kind of two different ways of calling it. Plugins, I said I would show. So if we open this up real quick. So this is just from the official PyTest docs. If we scroll this far, we're only at PyTest dash something that starts with C. So as you can tell, there are a lot of PyTest plugins. And I have only used probably a small subset of them. There's ones to create test coverage statistics. So am I testing all the lines of code that I'm writing? Because you could have 100 tests and actually only be covering like 10% of your code base, which probably would be a super great test suite. Let's see, what else do we have? Azure Data Factory integration tests. Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff here. Yeah. Question? Marks, which I talked about, so that's a way to basically be able to sort of like CSS, like add a class to a test where you can like, similar like jQuery where it's like I want to select everything that's like dot title or something like that. You can kind of do the same thing with PyTest marks. I'll show a quick example of what that might look like. So if we just do this really quick and rename it 2, that's a terrible name. I'll do PyTest mark 2, and we'll import PyTest. The reason I'm adding these new lines is because, just a quick aside, typically when importing Python stuff, you want a chunk that's all from the standard library, a chunk that's third-party libraries, and then your actual like local code. So in this case, I'm only have 3 packages, so it just looks like I'm putting new lines, but that's, if I was going to import like logging, I would put it up here because it's from the standard library and alphabetically sort it. There's things that'll do that automatically for you, like iSort is probably the most popular tool, but regardless. So these tests are actually just the same right now, which is fine for what we're going to do, but if we do PyTest-m for mark and do 2, we should see that it just runs 1 test, or no tests. Interesting. So we might have to configure that. Let's see. I don't remember how to write this off the top of my head. There's like a million different like YAML.init, like toml, and they're all slightly different. So I don't know how to write them offhand. Let's see if that does it. Unknown config. Okay. Sorry, I'll have to look it up real quick. PyTest, yeah, right. Working with custom markers. PyTest.mark.2. That should work. -m web test. That should work. Interesting. I'm not sure why that's not working.
The marks themselves don't need to be snake cased, or
This guy?
yeah, I see.
So it doesn't. Oh, I see. You like? Should this be snake case?
Yeah.
So. Yeah. No, that's a fair question. In this case, no, because this is actually using the PyTest's mark function, or points to this mark generator. So this is actually like a decorator that's wrapping the whole test, and then it's kind of a, I guess looking at it, there's not really much other Python syntax that looks that way, but in this case, that is the proper syntax. Unknown config. pytest.init. So this is, I guess, quick segue. This is basically where you could configure all of your PyTest options. So you could set it to just run certain tests by default. You could like exclude certain markers by default, as well as other things. Let's see if that works. Oh, wait. Ah, there we go. Probably helps if I tell it the module or the folder to run in. And if I save the file. Man, this is where I need the help from the audience. You guys got to notice my stupidity, like not saving files and stuff. No, it's fine. Okay, there we go. So you can see here we have two files. One has the mark that's 2, and one has no mark. I'd say more common things than just some random word is something like integration, or functional test, or like a smokescreen test, or like a UI test, like kind of just other types of tests. If you, for example, were using integration and wanted to run all of your non-integration tests, you can just do not integration in quotes. And in that case, it won't run anything because, again, I'm not doing the file name. And PyTest is helpfully complaining that I didn't register this as a custom mark in my pytest.init. So if I do that, it'll stop complaining at me. Boom. Works. Questions about marks? Or I keep calling them marks. They're called markers, but it's just pytest.mark, so that's just what I say.
It seems pretty useful. Do you use those a lot?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, I typically use them to separate out just an average unit test from like an integration test, which isn't something I've really defined. Unit test is typically just testing a unit of work, like a small piece of a component, where something like an integration test might test sort of a beginning to end interaction. So I guess one example is, say, like in Django, if you have a user who goes and fills out a form on the website and they hit submit, and the form goes and saves them all to the database, and then calls an API with some of the data from the form, and then I don't know, like returns a response to the user with some of that data from the API. Unit test might just test a small little part of that. It might just test that if I call the API, and you would probably mock out the API or replace the actual call to the API with like a fake call. You would just test that small little part. But an integration test might test like top to bottom that whole interaction, and you might not even mock out the API. So I guess that is one thing I haven't talked about is like mocking, which wasn't on my outline, but we can dive into that towards the end if we want to. Other things I use markers for is like the DjangoDB thing, to basically just use ones that are already built into some third-party package that I'm using with PyTest. Yeah, it's usually just to separate out different types of tests. Some tests are more expensive or like take longer to run or in setup, and so I don't necessarily want to run them all the time for whatever reason. I just want to run them sometimes. Or again with Django, migrations, which is basically if you have like a database and say you have a users table, and then you have like all your columns for your users. Say you add a new column, what a Django migration would do is basically codify the changes it's going to make to the database to go and add that new column. And so I might write a test that, and there's an extension for this to help you test migrations, Django migrations. But I might have a PyTest marker that's just like migration tests. And typically, kind of once you perform a migration, you're not really re-performing it unless you have like a brand new database. So you might not want to run your migration tests all the time. You might just want to like write them, verify that the migration is going to do what you expect, run it, and then like, okay, I have my test, I can run it if I need to, but I don't really need to be running it like as part of my CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah.
That could be one thing. Yeah. anything else on markers? Or questions, I should say. Cool. Let's bounce back to Phil, still our only viewer because none of the other viewers have tests or have the link. CLI options. So the PyTest CLI is pretty extensive. Let's open up a terminal really quick. Crank it up. So you'll see we have all sorts of stuff in here. Oh my gosh, there's so many. So a few ones that stick out to me are if we go to, what is this, Spokane Python User Group. What is this, testing in Python. So now I'm in my repo, I'll run PyTest. And so if I just wanted to run a test that matched like a naming regular expression, so in this case, I have one test that has the letter 2 in it, I believe. So let's just, I don't know, name this to something more, has this word. So we'll do this, and then we'll do test.py. So in this case, it's only going to run the one test. So -k is short for, I'm not actually sure what it's short for, but there's probably a long form version of that argument.
So wait, that ran any test with the word this in it?
Sorry?
That ran any test with the word this in it?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and I don't know how extensive you can get with like regular expression or like pattern matching. Typically, I'm just using like looking for like either the prefix or like a postfix for a test. I don't know if this will work, but we're gonna try it. That's exactly what I wanted to do. No, that's not what I want to do. I prefer, oh, hey, there it is, -k. Okay, I guess there's no long form version of -k. That's funny, because typically there's like -a and then --all, but I guess in this case it's just -k. Yeah, anyways. Another thing you might want is the PyTest by default is relatively sparse output. You do get colors, the green dots. If there's one thing you take away from this talk, it's live for the green dots, not the yellow dots, not the red dots. But you might be wondering, like, okay, what happened, like in my test, or what specific test was it running? And so you can do -v for like single verbose mode, and that gives you a little bit more output, or in this case, like the same amount of output. And you can do -vv for like super ultra verbose mode, and that'll actually typically give you a little bit more output, though in this case it looks like it's basically the same. That's probably because our test suite's pretty simple. But oftentimes I'm running my tests with -vv because I either just want to watch all the green cascade down the screen, or I want to see like where it's at while it's running. Sometimes when you don't run in verbose mode, it will sort of minimize the amount of output that it's showing you when the test fails, and so this will kind of expand that and like allow you to. So actually, I guess one example would be if we go in here and we change our test to fail. Are there 1,000 Star Wars characters? Probably not. Maybe. Actually, probably there is, but not in this API. So, I thought that would expand it out more. I guess PyTest even has limits. That's okay. But you can see it's kind of giving us like quite a bit of output. Other helpful CLI things, -m for markers. You can set the log level. That's pretty general Python stuff. You can, sometimes your terminal won't use the color by default, and so you can sometimes force it to do color using like -color equals yes. -q to decrease verbosity. Yeah, that's kind of the main stuff that I use. One other thing is, so by default, PyTest will actually capture any logging or print statements that you have. So I'll show that really quick. Let's do for, so where's our test that was failing? We have results. So we could do for item in actual, which is actually a dictionary, results, which looks like a list, print item. And it's complaining because I used type hints to say that this is going to return a list of strings, but I totally lied. It's actually a dictionary. That's okay. Python doesn't care. It doesn't enforce type hints at runtime. So anyways, if I come down here, so this will print everything out. So I guess it was kind of hard to notice, and it's kind of printing out a lot of, let's just do the name, because that's sort of a lot of stuff to look at. So we'll notice here captured standard out. So it's basically capturing our print statements and our login stuff, and it waits until the very end of your tests to finish running before it'll start printing it all out. And sometimes if you're maybe just running a single test or something, or running like a test that's taken a while and you want to see output immediately as it's running, you can basically tell PyTest, hey, don't capture my output, just let it print out to the standard out as it's being printed in the code. And so here you'll see there's not actually any captured standard out, and you'll notice that we have everything printed out before we see that the test failed. So just a small thing. It can be kind of frustrating if you're like, why is my print statement not working? Well, it's because PyTest helpfully captures the output for you and just displays it at the end, kind of assuming that if you have a lot of tests, you probably don't want to see output intermingled with all of your test results. You probably just want to see it maybe all at the end when all your tests have either passed or failed and you go and inspect it. Still just Phil hanging out, maybe. So that's the all options. How many of you use VS Code? 2, 3, okay. What else do you guys use? PyCharm, all right.
Also use Spider.
I've never used that actually.
Okay.
Is that
It's
like a wrapper for Anaconda?
No. I think they're trying to mimic MATLAB.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I have not used that one. I've heard of it.
It's a variable viewing window. I'm sure all that is like way better than VS Code, but that's not it.
Okay.
Aside from that, for VS Code, so.
Makes sense. I can go in, what are we at? We're at 7. I can show debugging tests with VS Code if people are interested. Sounds like less than half of people use VS Code, so yeah, it's helpful. Okay, it should be pretty quick, so I can show it really quick. It's not like our tests are like cutting edge right here. So if you use VS Code and have the Python extension installed, which I have too many extensions installed. And the Python extension will also install PyLance by default, which is a wrapper around PyWrite. It's basically Microsoft's Python language server, which enables like linting. You can see here. Well, not there. Linting, like type completion, that kind of stuff. But anyways, so if you have those installed, and we can just do in this case unit test or PyTest. Obviously PyTest, and root directory. So it actually probably do most of the setup for us. Maybe. So why aren't you working? This may have been why it wasn't running these tests by default. There we go. Yeah. So I think it has to be test underscore something, or like test and then something else. If you just do test.py, I guess PyTest doesn't pick it up by default, which was probably why when I was just running PyTest without actually specifying the name of the file, it was basically puking at me. So here, if you haven't used VS Code, it's probably very similar to most modern IDEs, including PyCharm. You can set breakpoints on the side. In this case, we'll just, let's set a breakpoint there. In our testing panel, we can either just run the test and ignore breakpoints, or we can run the test, or we can debug the test, and if you have a breakpoint set or an error gets raised, it'll basically enter like debugging mode, and it'll pause. And here you have, I'm sure PyCharm is basically the same. You can step into a call, you can step over a call. You can watch variables over here. So if we wanted to see what item was every time we went through the for loop, we also have our local variables. One thing that is helpful is if we do Control-Shift-Y, which is basically just a keyboard shortcut to open up the debug panel. You can also get there by opening the terminal and going to debug console. Is in our breakpoint, we can type in whatever code we want here. So if I wanted to print actual.keys, it wouldn't work. I guess, I don't know why. Oh, probably, okay, let's just do actual dot. So PyTest is probably capturing that output, but if we just do PyTest, actual.keys, so let's do item.keys. So you can basically just debug here, and you can get to a point in the middle of your test, in any Python code for that matter, or probably virtually any Python code, and you can basically do like REPL, read, evaluate, print loop, but you can do that from like within the middle of your test. So that's kind of nice. Let's see, what species is Luke Skywalker? Any guesses? Nothing. Oh gosh, they played us. What is it? Did that open? Page not found. That sucks. There we go. Species. He's a droid. Wow. Wait, is that actually, maybe that's probably not actually Luke Skywalker. It's probably someone else. Oh, C-3PO. Okay. You heard it here. Luke Skywalker's a droid. Yeah, he's got a robot. Hand. Yeah. Cool. So that's debugging with VS Code. I mean, that's PyTest or testing specific, but it's basically you can add a launch.json file in the .vs Code folder and basically set it up to like run your web server or just your data science code, whatever you want, and you can add breakpoints the same way as we just did. I was trying to keep this to an hour and pretty much hit that. I can talk about fixtures a little bit too. They're not that crazy, but that's kind of the bulk of the talk. Questions or things you would like to see?
Real quick question just about the debug window. How did you get that set up? I never actually had it run.
The what?
The little debug window at the bottom of VS
Oh.
Code where you could enter the variable. Yeah, right there, the debug console.
Yep.
Yeah, because when I run it in debug mode, it pops up with the errors in the variable new window on the side, like you're saying, but I've never actually seen the console do anything, so I'm not sure if I'm missing
Yeah.
a plugin or something like that.
Okay. So let me zoom out.
It's kind of high with the terminal, right?
Yeah.
There's multiple options with the terminal.
Right. So if
yeah, it usually hides under the triple dot.
Maybe that's it. I'm just curious if you had to install anything, maybe something was missing.
Good question. So it's there by default.
Okay.
You do need, like I mentioned, the Python extension.
Yeah, I have that.
And then, yeah, it is sort of hidden away. Probably the easiest way to show it is either, so I wish I had an extension to show you guys the keyboard shortcuts I was using, but I don't. But Control backtick will open and close the terminal. And so if you can open the terminal, you can just navigate to the debug console. If you're really, feeling frisky, you can do Control-Shift-Y to open and close the debug console. But that one's like another extra button. So I just, write bad code, so I guess I'm debugging all the time. So I've got it down. There's probably another way to open it down here as well. Yeah. View debug console if you're more of a UI person. Yeah. I guess another thing too, if you are running actually that does raise another good point. If we run our tests, they won't actually go to like the terminal if we're running them from within VS Code. So we'll have to go to this output pane and scroll down to PyTest test log. Will actually show us the output that we were previously getting when we run it from the command line. So sometimes I just like, even if I'm using VS Code's debugging and stuff, sometimes if I just want like to see it on the command line, I'll just go run PyTest from the, you know, bash or whatever. But if you don't want to do that, it is here to look at and admire, as well as it gives you this kind of like little red bar that you can click on and sort of see the same information for that specific test. So, okay, real quick. At pytest.fixture decorator to mark a fixture factory. So if we do test, you know, API fixture, you could do something like requests dot, if I import requests, whatever, you know, post, you know, slash login, whatever. This is response equals, you know, response dot text, maybe JSON dot loads. So parse the response and get like API token. And then if you need this API token, you can do this fake API token. You can do two things with fixtures. Well, you can do a lot of things with fixtures, but there's kind of two ways to return from them. You can return it directly, and then if I was to use this fixture, which the way I would use it is I basically add it as a parameter, and PyTest is actually filling in that it's giving us the argument for this parameter when it runs the test. So basically it just needs to be able to find a fixture of the same name, and there's some built-in ones. But then here, I could actually do, you know, API token equals API fixture, and I'll actually get whatever I returned here. There are times where you might want to maybe test something to do with like I/O. So maybe you want to do with open some file.txt write mode as fout, and then, you know, I don't know, write hello. And then say you wanted to run your actual test, you could yield, which will basically yield control to the test, and it will run the test. And then if you want to run some cleanup code, you could do that after your yield and do like os.remove some file.txt. So that's another good way to use, or a good reason to use fixtures, is you can basically have some setup and cleanup code, and you can also yield out some value. So if you wanted to yield the file name or give the file name to your test, then you could do, again, call API fixture and get the value that it yields. And then after the test actually finishes running, it would still run your cleanup code. So fixtures are relatively powerful, and there are some built-in ones. If you're wanting to learn more about them, PyTest docs, obviously a great place to start. And there's one called Monkey Patch, which is particularly useful. It allows you to monkey patch things, which is basically just like changing the way some third-party package or internal function works without actually going and like changing the source code. Like you're not actually changing the Python standard library, but if you say don't want, or maybe like the request package, you don't actually want it to ever go and make an HTTP call to some remote server, you can monkey patch the requests package to replace its actual logic to make an HTTP call with, you know, whatever you want it to do. So, okay, I lied 5 minutes ago when I said that was the end. Now this is the end, unless there's any other questions.
I had a quick question. You mentioned that you use a plugin that provides statistics for you.
Yes, so I believe it's pytest-cov. Provides, so that one provides like coverage reports, like things like test coverage statistics. You can also get it to generate, let's see, XML, JSON, and HTML output. The HTML output in particular is nice if you want to go and actually navigate like around the results of the test, and you can see it'll actually highlight like lines of code in red if they didn't get run by a test, and ones in green if like the test coverage hit them. So this is actually a pretty powerful extension.
So pretty, it's more robust than like the TAC COV
Than the what?
Tap COB. I think it's like a.
Yeah, I believe so. I don't think the PyTest one has any sort of built-in ability to like generate any like HTML documents or anything like that. Yeah. Other questions on really anything that I covered? Okay. If you guys do, want to look back on notes or go look at the slides, SpokanePython.com is a thing. And you can look at previous meetups. Some of them have the recording, which you can also look at the Inteltech YouTube channel for the recording, as well as links to the code samples. 404 not found. That's probably because I was updating this immediately before the, I don't know what just happened. The slides are right there, so if you want to go relive this talk, you can certainly do so. So. Thank you guys. Thanks any viewers who are online. It's probably just Phil. Phil says VS Code rocks. Thanks, Phil. All right. Thank you guys.